And good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session, which is the UN System Side event on cities and urban development as a catalyst of climate action. And when we come together at a climate conference, we're aware of a contrast. On the one hand, we know that cities are very important when it comes to climate change. They're major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, and they're homes to concentrated populations of vulnerable people and assets that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But on the other hand, the UNFCCC is a creation of member states, and cities fit uneasily within the UNFCCC framework as non-member actors and non-state actors. And so we will, but increasingly through the years in the UNFCCC, cities have been moving more and more to take an important point within the discussions. And I think today on this panel, we're going to explore a little bit of this contrast and this uneasy fit. So we expect a rich discussion. Now, the topic of addressing climate change in cities is a very cross-sectoral issue. It addresses a lot of different aspects. And in the same way, we have a very diverse group of speakers and panelists who are going to speak to us. While I'll introduce each speaker as it's their turn to speak, just to give an overall sense of the event. We're going to start with a presentation on a recent research on what is the urban content of nationally determined contributions. And that will, in a way, set the stage for our discussion. And then we have a very distinguished panel that will be joining us, one or two of whom are still going to be joining us. We have a couple of surprise presenters also that will be joining us. So I will introduce the panel and the speaker in the order that they come up. But to start things out, let me invite, my name is Robert Kehoe, I'm with UN Habitat. And to start, though, let me invite a colleague, Marcus Mayer, also with UN Habitat, to present research findings on what is the urban content of the nationally determined contributions. Marcus.
Thank you very much, Bob. And welcome to our side event. We would just like to present briefly the key findings and a snapshot overview of current research we have been conducting. Because as Bob was rightfully mentioning, cities have become more and more a key topic in the climate negotiations. So our research was aimed at finding out more concretely how member states are addressing the question of urbanization within their nationally determined contributions. And the good news and the most significant finding is that over 2/3 of countries are actually addressing or including urban development and urban issues within their nationally determined contributions. We have 26 countries that have very strong urban content in their NDCs, and over 84 countries that have moderate or medium content, urban content in their NDCs. So 2/3 of all countries, 110, are foreseeing urban climate action. And when we look at the countries, where they are addressing urban content and what urban climate actions they are foreseeing, we're seeing in the part of the NDCs where the challenges are described, we see a very heavy focus on adaptation. The dark blue column is the countries with strong urban content, and the light or medium urban content. So we will see over almost 70 countries have urban adaptation as a challenge identified. We will see then with much lesser prominence, financial, technical, institutional capacity, mitigation, and other considerations. And the types of urban challenges countries have addressed in their NDCs are primarily flooding and precipitation oriented. Floods, sea level rise, droughts, temperature rise, storms, and so on. And on top you will see concrete quotes from the NDCs where they are addressing urban issues, just to give an example. moving from the challenges to the actions, where countries are in the NDCs foreseeing urban actions, is much more balanced between adaptation and mitigation, financial capacity, so for example, financial mechanisms in the countries, technical capacity, institutional and others. The urban actions foreseen by the countries are mainly clustered in the four sectors: transport, buildings, energy and waste. These are all four sectors with high mitigation potential and easy and quick low-hanging fruit type of interventions that are able to support countries in meeting their climate goals. In the last parts of the NDCs, where the countries are requesting international cooperation, these cooperation requests mainly group in financial and technical assistance. So this is an opportunity for the international community to meet these requests very specifically and identify exactly the country's needs. So as a very brief summary, we have seen that over 2/3 of the countries have urban content in the NDCs. That is a very encouraging figure. The current challenges are mainly related to flooding. So this is a quick reaction to this to these challenges is needed. Actions foreseen in the NDCs are more balanced towards mitigation and adaptation. We see a significant mitigation potential in urban sectors. We have clearly identified requests and financial support and technical cooperation and technology transfer. And to sum up, we can very clearly see that through the NDCs, with the commitment of local governments, there is a high potential for vertically integrated climate action and for working with cities to meet the national climate goals. Thank you very much.
Stay here for a minute. Thank you very much, Marcus, for that very quick overview. Before you go, just could you comment on one interesting finding as part of this research, which I think is very helpful for the urban community to help unpack the NDCs? Is that, and that's, it seems, could you go back to the slide that that shows the countries and how their emphasis on addressing urban issues? The world map. It's something of a paradox, isn't it, that the more urbanized countries have less emphasis on addressing urban issues in their NDCs, but some of the rapidly urbanizing but least urbanized countries are really emphasizing. Is that a general pattern we're seeing?
So the pattern the research has found out is exactly this: the highly developed countries, highly urbanized countries, tend not to have a specific mention of urban content, maybe because there are other mechanisms to work with cities. But as we see on the map, there's a high concentration of urban content in NDCs in Africa and Asia, which are generally rapidly urbanizing regions. And I think that finding which you mentioned can be supported by that research.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
And maybe just as a last mention, we have launched this publication with a much more in-depth findings, where you can find this on our website. And also I would like to acknowledge our lead cooperating partner from RECNET, Dr. Nicola Tollin, which is one of the lead authors, who will just, maybe you can just stand and say hi and show the publication. Very well done.
Thank you very much. There's been a big effort, and that in collaboration and for your habitat. And I believe that it's a common goal to keep on working on this line in order to get more detail out of this first inception report. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Now we have two. This is a busy week at the COP, and we have a couple of speakers who are still coming to the room, but I just want to check if they've arrived. We have Mr. Driz El Yazami from the Moroccan Human Rights Council. I think he's still on his way, and is Ms. Carolina Skog, the Minister for Environment for Sweden, she's still on her way, I believe. So we will pick them up into the program when they arrive. But we would like to proceed now, and we are again very pleased to have a distinguished panel here with to invite Mr. Glenn Murray, the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change for Ontario, Canada, to talk about the important role that at the subnational level that regions or provinces can play in implementing the Paris Agreement. And with all the panelists, we have invited them to try to include one or two city level examples to help illustrate their points. But Mr. Murray, we welcome your interventions, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for attending. I was mayor of a large city in Canada called Winnipeg, which is actually the capital city of the province further west from the one I'm in, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change in, and I was Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure before. So my involvement in politics has sort of been a bit nomadically odd. In Ontario, we've decarbonized our electricity system. We closed all our coal plants, so which is important for things like electric vehicles, so that you're not plugging into a coal plant, but you're plugging into a mixture of strong green feed-in tariff programs similar to Germany's with solar and wind, some significant hydro and nuclear. So it's a pretty decarbonized system. That was the largest GHG reduction in the history of North America to this point, and was followed by a cap and trade system and a very comprehensive and significantly urban-focused action plan, which is the $8 billion coming from our cap and trade system over the next 4 years is being really heavily invested in what I call, so if you become a post-coal or a post-fossil fuel electricity system, you really start to look at an emissions profile that has a very municipal urban focus to it, very suburban focus. So 35% of our remaining emissions are from the transportation sector. We're the largest auto manufacturing jurisdiction in Canada, the United States, with 5 major global automakers with multiple facilities. We're 75% of Canada's heavy industry, so we're a very carbon intensive economy. We're already 6% below in Ontario 1990 levels. I think we in Quebec are about tied for the largest carbon reductions, certainly in North America, and tracking now with pretty much a guaranteed reduction of 15% by 2020 and 37.5% by 2030, and which is 2.5 times what Canada's commitment so far at Paris Agreement is. So it'll say something about the rest of the country, which is much of it less urban. So we're looking now at really that 35% from transportation and 25% from buildings is really what we're trying to tackle. So the programs are very based on a matrix that of funding of that billion that looks sort of vertically and horizontally at the different solutions. So there's a large emphasis on working with the construction, both companies, unions, on a series of programs that help decarbonize existing buildings and retrofit them and set new standards for new buildings. A massive investment of about $160 billion over the next decade into infrastructure, much of that into the electrification and decarbonization of our regional transportation systems and the building of new LRT lines. A lot of work in electric vehicles, which is a bit of a contradiction because we don't have really we have very few electric vehicles being made in Ontario because about 80% of our auto sector is exported out mostly to the United States. So that is a big challenge. A lot of money is going into R&D, into electric mobility and funding the auto sector to do that. While most people think of oil as an Alberta thing, we have 35 petroleum and chemical refineries in Ontario, one of the largest clusters of fossil fuel refining. So when you recognize that we've absorbed, we're also growing by about 250,000, about 120, about half of all immigration to Canada, which is quite robust. It comes to Ontario. So we had massive growth. Our biggest challenge is that we're structurally we expanded dramatically in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s into very low density suburban belts around our large cities. And and the land use and transportation challenges are one of our largest, and our growth plans are another major aspect of it. We have regional growth plans and green belts that are trying to change 40 or 50 years of low density carbon intensive development that sort of use a liter of gasoline to get a liter of milk because you just simply can't walk. There's also been a traditional land use disconnect between land use and transportation planning. So the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, which is the largest urban agglomeration in Ontario, about 7 million people, adds 34 million square feet of office space every year to its region. 90% of that is not located near any of the higher order transit, regional rail, subway, or LRT. And one of our challenges is not enough of our LRT is going to employment lands. It's a bit of a build it and they will come rather than build it where they want to go. So if you think about that, the second largest head office cluster in the country is in Calgary in Alberta. We add Calgary's office space every 10 years. So one of the things driving carbon intensity and congestion is this disconnect from land use and transportation, which is when I got back into policy, the mission I've taken on, having been the minister responsible for transportation and land use, and that's really challenging. I think in signing the Under 2 MOU and being a member of the Compact of Regions, we really take this idea of under 2, and there's this you don't get an elegant alignment that often if you're a policy wonk. But when you think that to stay under 2 degrees, it means all of us as human beings have to be under 2 tons of emissions per person. So I and my partner, Rick, decided we would try to do that. And we couldn't figure out how to do that without an internal combustion engine. So we're a 2-bicycle household. We ride everywhere. So we tackled the transportation. So we've started to live this experience of living under 2 of it. We were at the average Ontarian emits 12 tons of carbon dioxide a year, GHGs. The average Torontonian in the city I live, about 7. I have a carbon calculator on my website, which works in most parts of the world, or if you're in an urban suburban environment, it's TorontoCenterPlan.org. It's my little website as a member of provincial parliament. And you can calculate from food, home heating, cooling, energy use and transportation choices you make, and your air travel to come here as well, exactly what your carbon footprint is. I'm now down to 2.8 tons. So I'm within 0.8 of getting there. And so if you think about a region like Toronto, Hamilton, we have a carbon budget of 14 million tons each year per person. If you use that as the basis for land use and transportation, you start to think about spatial organization and personal life. And for me and my constituents, to get my community to be net zero, it was important. Like, people understood recycling. Actually, blue box recycling was invented in Ontario by one of my party and counterpart in the 80s. It was easy. You put the box in front of the door, you send them a list of what goes in the box, and people can participate in it. It's hard in an environment to get people down to. So I'm the chubby middle-aged guy who cycles to work every day, and I do that. And then you discover the limitations of the infrastructure choices and the lack of complete streets. So that's been really cool. The other thing I think is that one of the things we ignore, and I'll close on this, and it was an interesting thing when I was mayor of Winnipeg, you asked me, was that we don't think about fiscal policy. We tax, property taxes in most jurisdictions are 2 taxes, a tax on land and a tax on building. There are a very light tax on land and a very heavy tax on buildings. And much of the suburban sprawl and many of the white areas on that map come from the fact that, having been a mayor with a city that had the highest per capita debt and the highest per capita taxes in the country, I cut the debt in half. And I cut taxes by 11% when I was mayor. I was the commie, pinko, gay, green guy from downtown. But one of the ways we did it is we changed the way the tax incentives work. So the vacancy rate was 60-odd% in downtown, in the historic center of Winnipeg, which is a National Historic Site. When I left, it was under 10%. And that was mostly by trying to compensate for the inherent bias in the property tax to be a light tax on land, which you want to tax more heavily so people use it more prudently, and you want a lighter tax on buildings so you get more intense development of sites, higher and better uses. So we allowed write-offs in the historic and already built it in brownfields. We allowed people to write off half of their investments in those buildings against their business and property tax, because that was the gap. People were putting $1 in an existing building and losing 50 cents every time they did it. And then we allowed a fund, because that wasn't enough. Most of these building owners had, their uncle Arthur left it to them because they hated the kid and they wanted the nephew to have the liability, not the inheritance. And these buildings were worth so little money. If you tore them down, the land under the parking lot was worth less than the demolition cost. So it was that fiscal policy. And I think that what we often don't talk about is that within 5 years, the vacancy rate dropped so dramatically. It was largely because we provided free transit in the downtown and changed the tax structure and massively incented reinvestment in brownfields and the existing environment, rather and actually truly cost sprawl and greenfield development to actually have to cover the full costs of new development. And we have so many hollowed out cities that we've de-urbanized by bad fiscal policy. So that was a success story we had in Winnipeg, which was one of the poorest cities. And this was when the oil boom was going on in Alberta. So it was depopulating, I got elected easily in Toronto because there were so many former Winnipeggers there. I always said it was Winnipeg's most successful colony. So I'll leave it at that. But I think, focusing on choices of two, factoring in a carbon budget, and then aligning it from the perspective of your citizens, that if you want them to be under 2, you have to provide the infrastructures, the choices they can't make to get there. And I thank you for your patience with me, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues up here.
Thank you very much, Glenn. This topic of fiscal policy and how working with other programs can help to make cities more compact and can start to address greenhouse gas emission issue. That's a very interesting and neglected topic, and I hope we can explore that with you further, as well as some other themes I think you raised. A lot to discuss there, and I hope we'll have time. We are trying to save time for questions at the end. So thank you very much for getting us off to a great start. Now, unless either of our 2 expected speakers are in the room, okay, and is Mr. Drizzle Yazami? He's not going to come. Okay, all right, very good. Well, all the more time for our panelists who have a lot of great insights to share and for questions. So thank you very much. So now let us turn though to another important topic. We're going to touch several different topics, and Glenn started us a bit on the topic of financing, of what is needed to invest in the 21st century in the sustainable city. And we'd like to continue with that topic. We're very pleased to have Mr. Juichiro Sahara with us from the Green Climate Fund, and the central actor perhaps in directing public resources towards climate change mitigation and adaptation. Cities is a strategic focus of the Green Climate Fund. And so, Mr. Sahara, we're very interested to hear about the experiences so far that the Green Climate Fund has had with urban-focused proposals that have come into your fund. Please, sir.
Thank you, Robert, for the Thank you, Robert, for the kind introduction. And first, apologies that our executive director ad interim, Javier Manzanares, was not able to join us. So my name is Juichiro Sahara, a resource mobilization specialist at the Secretariat, and I'll be making the presentation. And my first speaker was very funny and in his presentation, and mine may not be as funny, but I hope you'll be as informative.
And Juichiro, could I just interrupt you? We do understand that Ms. Carolina Skog, the Minister for Environment from Sweden, is in the room. If you would please join us on the podium, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. GCF's approach to cities includes focusing on transport, energy, water sectors, and how relevant the projects can reduce both cities' contributions to CO2 emission and its vulnerability to climate change. This integrated approach to urban infrastructure offers both resilience and mitigation benefits. And in our result areas, we specifically mentioned these 3 points as part of our result areas. 1, infrastructure and built environment. 2, building, cities, industries, and appliances. And 3, climate resilient infrastructure. So our projects will be covering these 3 areas. And up to now, in the 2 years of our operations, we have approved 27 projects for 1.2 billion. And out of this, we have 4 projects which could be considered urban projects. And I will introduce the 4 projects. The first one is a project in Armenia implemented through UNDP. We approved US $20 million in grant to make energy efficient loans for building retrofits more affordable. And this is a mitigation project. Second, there's a project in El Salvador implemented through IADB. And we approved total of USD $21.7 million in loans and grants to encourage energy efficiency investments by the small and medium enterprises. 3, the next 2 will be adaptation projects. One will be in Fiji, implemented by ADB and also in cooperation with EIB, if I'm correct. We approved USD 31 million grant to strengthen the water supply management through the design and construction of a new water intake. This will help improve the water management in Suva City, the capital city, and improve sewage coverage, thus enhancing resilience of water supply and sanitation. And finally, our 4th project is in Senegal, implemented through AFD of France. We approved US $16.7 million grant for flood risk mapping and hazard monitoring to increase the resilience of urban areas and hard investments in drainage and sanitation infrastructure. And when I look at the trends for the urban projects, in the last board meeting back in last month, we reported that we had 44 funding proposals for the total of 3.4 billion for GCF funding. And out of this, about 45% is under the urban sector, which includes energy access and generation, transport, energy efficiency, and also infrastructure resilience. So I think it's safe to say that the funding proposals, the trend in the GCF pipeline, that many of these are under the urban sector. And I'll leave it to you that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juichiro, for that update. And I counted, you mentioned 4 projects. I counted 2 that were mitigation, energy efficiency, Senegal adaptation, and was the Fiji project, was that an adaptation?
That's an adaptation.
Adaptation.
Yes.
Okay, so 2 and 2 right
Yes.
now. Okay, very good. Thank you. Obviously an important player, and with a catalytic role also to leverage additional resources that are needed. So thank you for that update. We're now very pleased to have Ms. Carolina Skog with us, the Minister for Environment from Sweden, and we will in particular we're hoping that you'll help us understand how this issue of vertical integration that we talk about, how at the national level, an enabling framework can help empower and enable action at the local level, and other issues of relating national and local action. So we look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. I am the Minister for the Environment, but I also have a specific responsibility for urban development within the government. And the point that we have set these 2 in the same portfolio shows the strength that we see in the action of urban development as a key way to face the challenge that we have ahead on the environmental side, but also, of course, when it comes to social issues. And in this, the integrated approach is often mentioned time and time again, but it's worth mentioning time and time again because it certainly is key. In Sweden, a municipality has a very, very strong role. They have strong powers, and that means that they can and have the responsibility to take an integrated approach. And I will say a few words on how we try to strengthen that from the side of the government. Because sustainable urban development is key for a livable urban development. How cities are planned, developed, how housing, urban mobility, traffic, public transport are coordinating are very important for environment, but also for sustainable growth and to create a good quality of life for all citizens. And cities are the engines of the global economy, offering opportunity to find innovative and competitive solutions to both societal and environmental issues, uh, such as increasing resource efficiency in consumption and production. The urban development is transforming our world, both in cities and in rural areas. And I also, this is in a practical sense, but not at least in a political sense. Because now, more than ever, we need local leaders to take on a strong leadership when and tackling climate change and social challenges. Cities and urban areas are the first and the foremost human settlements, and that should be developed to improve the living conditions and the environment of its present and future citizens. And there are several things to consider, and the livability of a city is often based on both qualitative and quantitative factors. In this context, sustainable urban development faces a range of different challenges which require purposeful and coordinated actions on all governance level and a good dialogue between those levels. And knowledge and research on how urban areas evolve is crucial and needed to create a sustainable urban development. And there are some things that I want to stress when we talk about the global level on debate on urban development. The first thing is the integrated approach to work together with the three dimensions on sustainability: economic, environment, and societal. And the second one is social inclusion and integration. From a European point of view, we have an important challenge to include and integrate all the refugees that have come to Sweden and to Europe, and to include them in our cities. The third one is gender equality, because it has been proven that women's empowerment and women's full and equal participation and leadership in the economy is crucial to create a sustainable development. And the fourth, which is very, very important for my country where we stand now, is sustainable transportation. Public and sustainable transportations, of course, has a key role to any successful city, both in terms of economic, social, and environmental development. And from our government, we have now vast funding directed to the cities. One of them is a special grant from which municipalities can apply in order to further promote and public transport. And we've set up this grant in a very specific way, asking and demanding for the municipality to show that they have a systematic approach. This is in order to be able to apply for the grant. So it's not unconditional. First, the municipality has to show up a systematic plan for housing and infrastructure. And then stress the need for this specific investment, and then we are willing to co-fund the investment needed. So this is, I think, is a good way to keep the responsibility on the local level, which I think is key, but also but demanding a systematic work from the national level, and being willing, of course, to participate in the funding. The fifth point stressing, and I want to stress, is the digitalization and the concept of smart cities, because we are convinced that innovative approaches and digital transition and the smart cities concept needs to be an integrated part in the work with sustainable urban development. So specifically when we talk about finding efficient tools enough to make the transition happening. And my last point is that what we're talking about when we talk about sustainable cities are innovative work, but not in the sense of pilot. We're actually talking about a transition. Transition in means of transport, transition in the means of energy, but also we're aiming at a transition in the social work, really involve all people and the future generation in the planning. And this is something completely different than what we have done when building modernistic cities with big gaps in terms of economic, big gaps in terms of knowledge, and of course a number of environmental issues. And only an integrated approach and only a close collaboration between different levels of society and the official and the private sector can make this transition happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention that raised some additional important issues. I think the emphasis you're placing on livability, that we can't just look at climate action by itself, but also what we sometimes call co-benefits, but from the perspective of local residents, those are the benefits that sometimes need to be emphasized. That also yield climate benefits also, and but other themes also. I was interested to hear about the grant mechanism that you have that fosters more progressive planning at the local level. So thank you for that intervention. Now we'd like to turn to another theme that is an important one in the area of cities and climate change, the area of data, and in particular with adaptation planning. And we're very pleased to have with us here Max Dilley. He's with the World Meteorological Organization that in recent years has been developing a portfolio of support in the area of climate services for urban areas. And Max, we'd like to hear about your experiences with that. Thank you. Please.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Let's see if I can get this to work. And scientific tools that can be brought to bear to address some of the issues that other panelists have already identified. And as was mentioned, I'm with the World Meteorological Organization. Now, the World Meteorological Organization is a UN entity which is a member state, it has member state representation, and very often the actual representatives are the directors of the national meteorological and hydrological services from the country. So our president, for example, is David Grimes. He's also the head of Environment Canada. And then we have Mr. Nassif from Meteo Maroc. So it's primarily, but not exclusively, made up of services that take observations and that provide different kinds of forecasts and analyses that can be used for a wide variety of things. So I'm going to just zero in, I don't know if I try it here. Yeah. on some of the services that are relevant specifically for urban areas and really focus on sort of two categories. One are the ones for adaptation and for reducing loss and damage perhaps. And the other one, which is more focused on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and on mitigation. And when I saw Deborah was coming up on the panel, I quickly added this slide because I actually think this is an excellent sort of framework that we can use. It comes out of the IPCC Working Group 2 report for the 5th assessment. And it shows that when you have concentrations of assets like you have in a city, infrastructure, people, economic activity, it can create a risk hotspot if it's also a place which is exposed to a lot of hazards. And when you have such cases, you can either try to reduce your exposure to those hazards, or you can try to reduce exposure, you can reduce vulnerability to those hazards. But you also now have feeding into that risk equation all of the emissions of greenhouse gases that are changing the behavior of the hazards and the climate. So it's become a very dynamic system with a lot of moving parts, and it needs to be addressed from both ends, managing the risks we have now, but also trying to keep the risks from increasing due to climate change. Yeah. So here are some of the ways that urban areas are affected by climate. So you can have air mass movements that affect air quality, extreme heat and cold waves, depending on where you live, many different kinds of climatic hazards, sea level rise now, not so much in Winnipeg perhaps, but in coastal areas. Oh, it's all right. Well, so you get the flooding at least. But in low-lying areas, many of which are heavily populated now, sea level rise is becoming a real concern, and storm surges accompanying some of these other hazards can cause significant damage. And then these hazards affect all of the different sectors and the human population's health. So you have all of those on the risk side, and then on top of that, the cities are contributing globally 70% of the emissions. So they are a threat as well as an opportunity to tackle some of the root causes. So this is a hazard map for Metro Manila that in the yellow shows the 2 to 10 year return period flood and the 100-year flood in blue. And we used to talk about return periods because it was assumed that the mean was stationary. Now this doesn't really work anymore because sometimes the 100-year flood could be the 50-year flood or the 5-year flood, and it's really not sure anymore when we throw out these return periods, whether what was true in the past is still going to be true in the future. But nonetheless, for land use planning, for building standards, for preparedness planning, knowing where these hazard-prone areas are, which can be done on the basis of historical patterns and modeling, is a very important tool for reducing the exposure of infrastructure and other key assets, economic activities that you have in urban areas. Then on the more dynamic side with variability and change, there is a big push now, and I'm showing one of the programs that we have that is supporting this work, to enhance urban observing systems to give much more finer scale information about what's happening on a local basis. And this can be used for air quality forecasting systems, for multi-hazard early warning systems. You have multiple time scales from daily to weekly to monthly to seasonal to interannual. There are places in the world that are teleconnected to El Nino and the Southern Oscillation, and we can sometimes see some of these hazards coming 18 months in advance based on whether an El Nino or a La Nina is forming. And so you put these observations together, you build up your forecasting systems, and then climate services is the idea of turning all of that into specific types of forecasts for certain types of decision making. Ozone alerts, haze forecasts, pollen forecasts, even sunstroke and human health types of forecasts that can be used by the authorities to inform the population to stay indoors or to shut down. They can suppress traffic and other things that will help manage some of these issues. Then the last two slides I have, and then I'm going to show just a short video, are about turning now to the greenhouse gas mitigation side of things. And as mentioned, the cities are a major emitter. And so there is a project under the Global Atmosphere Watch to begin to equip cities to actually identify where these emissions are coming from, the point sources. So here's just a satellite-derived image from Los Angeles, and you see those little pink blobs. Those are places where, I can't really see my own slides, but I think it's methane, is rising above the background levels. And this shows that there's some kind of emission coming from that point. Now, with combining this with ground-based detections, you can actually trace back the emissions to their sources and identify the source, which in this case was some kind of petrochemical facility which was leaking somehow. So I'm going now in a technical video that gives a little bit more information about how that works.
Our ability to measure the global rise in concentrations of greenhouse gases helps us understand the critical problem of climate change and its causes. Thanks to advances in science and technology, we can now use atmospheric monitoring to map a clearer picture of greenhouse gas concentrations, from the national level right down to individual cities. Cities and megacities are densely packed with sources of greenhouse gases, from industry to housing to transport and energy production. It's no surprise that they account for 70% of global emissions. Today, we have the tools to map in greater detail a city's greenhouse gas sources and sinks. First, high-resolution monitoring is achieved through networks of instruments on tall towers, satellites, and aircraft to provide a detailed picture of greenhouse gas concentrations. These data are then integrated with meteorological information such as wind and rain patterns, making it possible to work backwards to model the origin and spread of emissions from different sources. The same approach can be used for monitoring pollution and air quality. With this crucial information at their disposal, urban decision makers can identify the main sources of GHG emissions, target the sources that are priorities for reductions, and design their citywide emissions policies and strategies. These new tools and technologies can help your city and others around the world to become a critical part of the climate solution.
So I guess the main message here is that all of these things that we just showed in a very sort of schematized view are currently being implemented to varying degrees in different places. And your National Meteorological Service, if you're an urban planner, would be the logical place to contact to see how these kinds of systems could be strengthened and put in place. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Also bringing several new important topics onto the table. I think this issue that it's hard to map floods now with changes in precipitation patterns, in sea level rise, with changes in flood patterns, which adds a new complication to land use regulation that tries to keep people out of high risk areas, and also this issue of trying to put together both information on greenhouse gas emissions and urban air quality into a unified approach, another very important area, we think. So thank you for that intervention. Now we'd like to turn, last but very much not least, to our final panelist, Deborah Roberts. And Deborah wears two very different and two special hats that make her ideally qualified to join this panel. On the one hand, Deborah is the IPCC co-chair of Working Group 2, so plays a very important role in the research agenda. On the other hand, Deborah is also the Sustainable City Initiative, or is also the Chief Resilience Officer for eThekwini Municipality in South Africa. So very well qualified to speak on the topic of how we bring science in to help cities address climate change. Deborah, thank you.
We don't seem to have a working mic here.
It's on.
Is it? Great. Super. And I think good afternoon, everyone. In many ways, I suppose I'm the missing jigsaw piece between Max and Glenn. Glenn spoke about how hard and innovative it is at the coalface of changing cities and regions and the way they do their business. And Max spoke to us about the importance of data and technology in enabling that change. But in that space, there's one big question: so what? Sounds fabulous, but does it actually change the world? And I would imagine that's why we're here in Marrakesh. This is the implementation COP. We got through the politics in Paris, and now the anticipation is that Paris will enable us through Marrakesh to change the world. So that so what question is really important. If we look to the role that science has played in answering that so what question, we've spent since 1988 as the IPCC rallying science and scientific assessment in a way that's enabled the very important discussions that member states and nation states have had, and that led us to Paris. Up until the end of last year, I was also a negotiator on the South African team, and it was quite remarkable the level of science that we found in the negotiating halls. Certainly there was politics, but science was a very important informant, and certainly the fifth assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was key to informing those kinds of discussions. The problem is, as we move from politics to implementation, so we move the geographies of action. We move them from negotiating halls into the geographies that Glenn spoke about. He spoke about his home, and he gets on a bicycle. And he monitors what he does in his day-to-day life. That all happens in a very real geography. What we haven't done is rally the science in the same way at the local level that we have at the international level to enable those discussions. And that's really where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is now looking to change its focus. It's very interested in this changing geography because that impacts on the type of assessment that it is going to do. It's obviously increasingly interested because of the level of ambition established in Paris. We're obviously looking to go well below 2 degrees, but we're also looking to pursue 1.5 degrees. We're interested in, as both Glenn and Max touched on, the ability to reduce greenhouse gases at the urban level. So that's an important area of assessment that we want to track. We want to monitor the kind of effectiveness that Glenn has had and others like Glenn going through time. So that's one area of assessment that's important. But the map that Marcus showed us, I think, was revealing at a number of levels. While we are certainly interested in what cities of the global north are doing, there's a very real reason that that map is largely blue in Asia and Africa. Those are the fastest urbanizing areas of the world. They are places where the cities that are developing are not going to look in any form or fashion like the city that Glenn comes from. They're going to be informal. The governance patterns are going to be different. They are going to be poorly resourced. And that poses different challenges for us. And I think that's why we're seeing that very strong emphasis on adaptation. Because the vulnerability and risk and level of hazard that those settlements are experiencing is new and unique. And it's also at a scale at which we've not encountered before. If we think about the current urban population, we're going to add another 2.5 billion urban residents by 2050. 90% of those are going to be in these small informal settlements in Asia and in Africa. And so we have to think about what that type of urbanization means, because many of the rule books developed in the global north might not necessarily apply in that space. So we can see that if we're interested in moving the science from the national and international level geography down to the local, it's going to have to be a new form of science to enable that assessment across that full range of cities, from the big cities of New York and Tokyo, all the way through to a small informal settlement somewhere, perhaps in Kenya or South Africa. So that's a broad spectrum of science we're going to have to bring to the table. It's not necessarily there. We've done a lot of good work, but the science has not necessarily pulled that together. And so what the IPCC is doing is changing its geography of interest. We've had two important panel meetings this year, the first in Nairobi, where the IPCC undertook to commit to look very carefully at the adaptation and mitigation opportunities and challenges that lie in cities in all of its reports, so in the 6th assessment, but also the 3 special reports that the IPCC has committed to produce in this cycle. The first, obviously, on 1.5 degrees, which is the invitation of the UNFCCC coming out of Paris to the IPCC. We have a second special report on oceans and cryosphere. And while Glenn doesn't yet have oceans lapping at his dwarf sea level rise exacerbates, I suppose that might be a factor. But the majority of cities lie in the coastal zone. So issues of sea level rise, impacts on coastal economies are important areas of interest. And our third special report, obviously, on land use and desertification, where urban areas are important drivers of transformation. And we've heard that. So that's our commitment during the 6th assessment cycle. But acknowledging that the science at this local geography is perhaps not as well developed as it needs to be, the IPCC has also committed, and this happened in the panel meeting we've just had in Bangkok, to host an international conference on cities and climate change science in 2018, in March of 2018, and we launched the call for a host city for that important conference in order to agree on a global research agenda for cities and climate change that nation states and other funding agencies can put their resources around so that we accumulate this landscape of science that the IPCC can assess. Because remember, the IPCC does not do any research itself. It only assesses the available research so that we can create a body of research that the IPCC can then use to produce the first special report on cities and climate change, which will be undertaken in the 7th assessment cycle. So I think we can see that science itself is now changing its attention. I think within this assessment cycle of the IPCC, there are going to be important gaps that need to be filled. And I think on the basis of what we've seen today, we can see how important that so what question becomes in understanding how people use the climate services and data to affect decisions, as we've heard Glenn take us through today, to determine the role that cities are playing in the NDCs and the significance of that contribution. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I think in the same way that there are now cities in this world with more than 5 million inhabitants that few, if any of us here in this room have ever heard of, in the same way, the science that is needed to catch up on this rapidly changing landscape to really provide the scientific underpinning for the negotiations and for programs and actions that address climate change is greatly needed also. So thank you for underlining that for us. Now we have, and thank you for all the panels on wonderful presentations and also sticking with the time. We do know have a number of issues on the table, and we'd like to invite some questions from the audience to our panel. So we could start with maybe let's collect 2 or 3 questions and then have a round of answers. I see one hand at the very back. Yes, sir. And there's a microphone. Please tell us your name and organization and a brief question or comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Carlos Dora from WHO, and I'm starting to work with cities in sub-Saharan Africa in mitigation. The question is around the links between what's been done now in terms of the investments described by the Green Climate Fund and the research questions that Deborah very appropriately identified. And I think it's great to have a research agenda in 2018. but you could have some indicators which perhaps can be a bit more creative in terms of impact of what the fund is doing, because these are opportunities for interventions. These are research opportunities. And we could be learning more from these investments. So I wonder if, to what extent there has been that kind of cross-fertilizing thinking in terms of building those connections around interventions too, so we can learn more and perhaps create a better discussion on the research agenda. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Trying to, starting to link together a couple of the themes that have been raised in this panel. Are there one or two other questions we could collect right now? There's two more hands up. Yeah, there's one and one down front.
I'm Dr. Woo Sung Lee from the Korea the Science and Technology Policy Institute. My question is also go to the sub-Saharan African area. They suffer from the drought because of the climate changes, and many people migrate to the urban because of this drought. And those urban slum, in the adaptation perspective, how can you address this issue? I'd like to ask a question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll take one more question. And then we'll have a second round, but we'll take this question first. Yes.
Sure. Clyde Graham with Fertilizer Canada, and I'm also on the board of the Soil Conservation Council of Canada. I think one thing that isn't addressed a lot is the impact of the growth of cities, usually over some of the best farmland in the world, and what that does to carbon sinks and a host of other environmental goods and services. So I'm just wondering how that is factored into the equation.
Very good. Thank you. Three questions. I think let's to take answers. Let's start with I think with the World Health Organization question. Maybe if Deborah and Juichiro would care to speak to that, and then any other panelists who'd like to respond to other questions raised. Deborah.
Great, thanks, Bob. I mean, I think that need to tie action and research together is absolutely critical. We haven't built effective bridges at this point in time, but the kind of actions that I spoke to in the IPCC begin to create the momentum for that discussion. So if we look at how one is thinking about the conference I spoke about, it's not going to be a bunch of scientists in a room talking about albedo and currents. It is in fact going to draw together practitioners, funders, and so on, so that we can begin to have that discussion about how we create the value chain that allows that information to move through those systems. So a lot of work does need to be done there. Certainly, we heard that the GCF is already spending money, and so it would be important to tie those loops. That's not to say that that research is not already being done, because I know through Future Earth and the Urban Knowledge Action Network, attempts are being made to fill that gap currently. Bob, do you want us to comment on the other questions now,
sure.
or while we've got it? Just on the question of droughts in the process of urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa, certainly drought is an issue, but it's not the only issue. I think we've got a very simplistic understanding of African cities. There's often a two-way flow between urban and rural, just because of the nature of our economies. And so I think even if there wasn't drought, one would see that push into cities just simply because of that very strong tie-in. And I think that's something we've got to underscore. I get quite worried when we only talk about cities. I think we must talk about city regions. Cities are very closely tied to their surrounding rural landscapes in many ways. And I think the way we think about that allows us perhaps to understand those issues of migration and so on. Certainly in the city I work in, we've got an equal outflow of people who move back into rural areas, whether it's drought or flood, just simply because the economies of those communities are quite different to what we might expect. Just to pick up on the growth of cities over agricultural land, absolutely 100% a major problem. I'm personally hoping that will come through very strongly in the land use report. We're about to scope that. That will happen in Dublin next year. And certainly if I look at some of the people who've been nominated into that process, I would imagine that's going to be a strong element of discussion.
Thank you. Juichiro, anything on the research aspects of investments?
Thank you very much. We have not gotten into how our, I guess, project is connected directly with the research aspect, but because we do receive contributions from the contributors, and we do need to show that our projects are making difference and making impact. So if you go to our webpage, we do show the expected reduction of emission, how many tons of CO2 reduced, and also the number of people impacted by our mitigation products. And also, we also show that how many the dollars that we use leverage, how many times we leverage the money from the private sector and public sector as well. So we hope we can, this data can be used in the future for research as well. Thank you.
Good, thank you. And our other panelists now to comment on any of these. Yes, Carolina.
Yes, thank you. One knowledge base that I would like to enhance and live forward are the regional investment banks that have been for a long time been involved with investment in urban development and have built up a knowledge base that are relevant in this and that should be used. And also another knowledge base is the cities themselves and the networking that is happening with peer-to-peer between the cities. And I think that the UN system should be working a lot with seeing and collaborating with the networks of cities that are existing and are evolving, such as the C40 networks. They have a very strong knowledge base that are very, very important. From the political side, to stress how important it is, the amount of investments that will be put into urban areas in the next 50 years will be the same that have been same amount that have been invested in cities up till now. Ever. Huge investment will be put into our urban areas, but the needs are even bigger. And it is crucial that these investments are made wisely. And we cannot afford to address one problem at the time. Then the investment will not be enough. We have to find investments that are integrated and that can address many challenges at the same time. When addressing things like floods, also putting social aspects into those investments are very, very important so that we can get the really thriving cities that we want and that are necessary to direct the problems that we see ahead.
Thank you. Max and then Glenn? No? Okay, Glenn.
Just, I'll try to be very quick. I think we often talk about sort of, there's so much change going on in our economies, and as my friend Jane Jacobs observed, it's the relationship bringing place into the economy and how all of these changes affect place. And I was very fascinated by what Deborah said. I just want to say one quick aside. Winnipeg is in a floodplain, one of the worst floodplains. As a matter of fact, our little sister city of Grand Forks, one year burned down as it was flooding. So it's a very hostile environment. The floodplain was just, the flood way was upgraded from a 1 in 100 to a 1 in 5 or 700 a year at a cost of billions of dollars, because the original mayor and council 200 years ago bribed the railway to build the railway crossing in the worst possible environmental location on the prairies rather than the high ground. So good planning is a good idea. But I mean, there's a whole bunch of changes going on in the economy, and they express themselves in different parts of the world, in different economies, in different ways. And in some ways, sometimes African cities are better adapted to those than North American cities. And I think it's interesting. What we're dealing with is we're dealing with a redistributive economy where things are now localized. So when we are decarbonizing our cities and our buildings, we have the problem of stranded assets, because people are doing geothermal, they're doing solar, they're generating all of their energy and heating and cooling on site. What do you do with your nuclear plants and your natural gas plants and your hydro dams when there's less interest in that? So if you have a developing economy where you may not have a lot of carbon intensive infrastructure, you sometimes can skip right over that to cell phones and to localized energy situations. And the dialogue between between these different types of economies, heavily industrialized economies, we have a lot to learn from each other. You know, we learned them because of the horrible droughts in Syria. The fastest growing constituency I have are farmers from Syria who are the fastest growing, and you know, and cultural change as well. I'm an out gay guy who has 40,000 first-generation Muslims from war-torn parts of the world who are my solid voting bloc. So if you don't think we can do cultural reconciliation, I could not get elected without a lot of Afghanis who are voting for the first time in Canadian elections. Just saying, because I'm tired of the stereotypes. Both ways, by the way. But we're also going to a creative economy. You know, when I was born, 2/3 of people in Canada worked in manufacturing for a living. That's now down to probably 20%. People finance, design, insure, create, entertain, engineer, do all kinds of things in our economy. And that's changed as well because it's changed the access and who gets to work and who doesn't. And where the dirtier jobs that we organized our city spatially to keep people living far away from work, because if you're working in a steel mill or a refinery or a larger auto plant, you probably didn't want to live next door to it. So we're seeing the reintegration of those cities, which obviously changes commuting, transportation, urban design. So we have to reinvent our industrial cities. And many countries in Africa and Asia are industrializing intensely, which were more integrated in informal cities, are now having to deal with a level of toxicity and work-related pollutants that have moved out as steel mills have moved out of Britain and into Turkey and places like that. The low carbon economy or carbon neutral economy totally changes conversations, totally makes fundamental rethinks about the priority of different investments. The shared economy of autonomous vehicles, where vehicles move on the roads for 21, 22 hours a day, rather than, and are stored for 1 or 2, rather than being used for 1 or 2, and stored for 20, dramatically it changes the urban landscape in large cities, because car storage is one of the biggest activities of cities. We store cars, we use more land to store cars. We won't be doing that likely in the future. So how does that change that? And how does that find expression in Africa and Asia? Do they become does transportation become an ownership of a product or the use of a service? And how does this Internet of Everything work there? I talked about creative economies, shared economies. I think that's yeah, I mean, that's pretty much. Oh, and the circular economy, we're going to a zero waste, which our biggest fight against climate change is the fact that when we make aluminum in Ontario and Quebec out of entirely recovered aluminum, we're not importing bauxite from Jamaica, which has a huge impact on Jamaica, both the health and economically, or alum. We're making aluminum with 5% of the energy when we have our steel mills on steel, or aluminum mills working 100% in a circular economy on recovered materials. We use 5% of the energy, and we don't resource extract anymore. So as we move to a circular economy, which would be the fifth change, that dramatically changes that. These are all cultural things. And the one thing, and I'll conclude by saying this, the biggest thing we don't talk about is culture. If we had lived like the Haudenosaunee, the Lakota, the Cree, and the Iroquois people, we saw nature is sacred, water is sacred, and we made decisions for our grandchildren's grandchildren, the 7-generation rule. We lived by that, not for the fourth quarter of stock returns and the 4-year election cycle, we wouldn't have this problem. And for many of us who come from a Western European industrialized, intensive, make it, status-based consumer society, Indigenous people who formed the foundation of our climate action plan, which is not urban, is focus on what you need rather than what you want, and focus on your grandchildren's grandchildren, and you'll solve the problem. And we have to have some humility in our hyper-educated, hyper-industrialized society to realize that maybe the core of this problem is in some of the roots of some of our cultural assumptions and beliefs.
Thank you. Let's see if we have a chance to take 2 or 3 more questions, and starting there. I see several hands, but starting there, and short questions, please.
Hello. Good afternoon. This is Bharat from TERI, the Energy and Resource Institute, a think tank based in India. So my question is, so you spoke about greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution in cities, but there's one other interesting thing, which is called the urban heat island effect. So I was just wondering if you could shed some light on that, and particularly with regard to what kind of interventions can be brought about to mitigate this problem in the building sector, in the transport sector, and probably to create artificial heat sinks because we're doing a study in an industrial city in the state of Orissa in India, which is basically a coal mining belt. So what happens is that due to the coal mining and steel activities, the entire district gets heated up, and we're thinking of ways to mitigate that. So if you could have some solutions for that, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I come from the Guatemala delegation, and I am counselor in terms of our urban development. Guatemala is like the countries you mentioned in Africa in a quick way of urbanization, coming from 5 million people in the rural area to 15 million people in the urban area in the next 20 years. It's a big change, and it's a driver of change very, very important. And in a way, it has been mainstreamed, the urban dimension, within the economic development strategy, but not so much in the environmental strategy. So I have like three important questions. The first one, urbanization is a change of behavior, and what kind of help of the IPCC can we have to measure in adequate way the effect of urbanization in a country? Because when we built NDC, it's not so good.
Quick, just one more question, please.
Two more questions.
Well,
One
just
for
one
you.
more,
For you is urbanization is about social housing in a big way. What kind of technology, and do UN Habitat can have like a technology framework or a technology inventory for housing? Because housing is cement, and when we build 5 million houses, it's about cement, and it's about this huge aspects. And the last one, it was the Ministry of Environment of Sweden, because urban is a territory, and our cities, and in cities, planning is very important. You can explain a little bit more of the grant mechanism you have between the national government and the local governments in order to have like good use planning for climate change sustainability.
Okay, thank you. Marcus, could we take one? We haven't had very good gender balance on this. Can we take a question from a woman, please? Yes.
Oui, bonjour, je me présente, Hachor Semira, je suis du Maroc, membre de l'Union nationale des ingénieurs marocains. Ma question, elle est pour Monsieur Sahari. Oui, il avait parlé du fonds.
And I'm sorry, could someone help translate this question after after that? Could you? Okay, okay. Yes. Okay, thank you. Good. Please continue. Okay.
Donc, ma question, c'est sur... il avait parlé sur des projets d'adaptation et des projets d'atténuation. Il avait parlé de 4 projets, mais ma question est sur les projets d'adaptation, surtout celui qui est destiné au Sénégal. Et je voulais avoir plus de détails. Quel est le type de... Comment a été ce projet pour avoir eu accès au fonds vert pour le climat, c'est-à-dire plus de détails sur ce projet-là qui a été abordé par l'agence française. Merci beaucoup.
Max, could you give us a quick translation of that?
No, I got it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
She's asking for details on the how the access to fund and what the details of the projects were in setting up.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And just one last quick question, Joe, and then we'll take a round of answers here. Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Joe Lightman from the World Bank. We're at the COP, so naturally we're zooming in on that intersection between climate change mitigation, adaptation, and cities. But when you go to a city and you talk to a mayor or a community leader and you say, I'm here to help you with climate change, they'll go, that's great, but I've got a whole range of other problems. I've got natural problems that have nothing to do with climate change. They have to do with earthquakes or health problems. I've got technological problems like failure of my urban systems or fires that really don't have much to do with climate change. And I've got socioeconomic and political problems that create unrest and instability in my city. So I guess the question is, how do we get perspective here and use climate change as an entry point for a dialogue to help cities become generally more resilient? And I guess it's a reason why Deborah's the Chief Resilience Officer for Durban and not the Chief Climate Officer.
Okay, thank you. So let's now take our responses to those questions, and also please include any concluding remarks that you have in your final intervention. And let's start down at that end of the table, Deborah, and then we'll move this way.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Just the two questions, the one around the role of the IPCC in informing potentially progress on the NDCs. I think that's already locked in. The 1.5 report is going to come out in 2018, which is the time of the facilitative dialogue. So I think we're already going to see feed in between those two processes. There's going to be an updating of the greenhouse gas emissions reporting through the TFI. So I think there's a very close allegiance between those two. And Joe, thanks for that question. It causes me to take off one hat and put on the other as a local government official. Of course, at the city level, you don't have a choice. You know, as Glenn indicated, you've got to deal with absolutely everything. You can't sit and cherry pick which issue is flavor of the month at the international level and choose only to deal with that. And so I think we are looking at an evolving conversation about how all of these issues, climate, biodiversity, sustainable development, come together into a new resilience package that cities are going to have to manage. And the important thing too is that that's not going to be a linear approach. Cities have to deal with these things all at once, and they're going to have to look to the trade-offs. You know, we often talk about these win-win situations. In many cases, cities are having to make really tough trade-offs, and that I think closes the cycle, because the science can help us choose how we manage those particular trade-offs. You know, how do different cultures respond to different pressures? How do we use different networks of cities to help bring in information so we don't have to reinvent the wheel? So I think this issue of resilience is probably going to become the overarching discourse at the city level.
Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah, well, I think all those changes are going on at the same time. You have to manage them, and you manage them all within these different frameworks. So we will have a more shared economy. We will own less things. We will share more things. I don't own a car. Most of my neighbors increasingly don't own cars, but that has to do with the geography that Deb was talking about. Those choices are defined by a whole bunch of different things. I'm not in a floodplain city anymore, for example. So the choices I would make if I was mayor of Toronto might be different than that. The nature of which cities are becoming more creative, more the cities that don't make things but design and do everything but makes things, and those cities who are increasingly becoming makers, and that changes that. So I won't go through them all, but you can go through those 5 major areas. Circular economy, because we're running out of resources, and for many of the larger industrial companies, advanced manufacturing is relying heavily on entirely recovered rather than mined and virgin resources. That changes things as well. But there's 2 things that culture is often left out of this: who we are, what we believe, what's our narrative, how do we express that in our lives, and how does that determine choices? That carbon calculator that I talked about, where you can calculate your own carbon footprint. It's always interesting because about the vast majority of my constituents, 2/3, 3/4, are born in other countries. My constituents in downtown Toronto speak 196 different languages. So I have this globally diverse community, and it's fascinating to me whether you're Tamil from Sri Lanka or you were an emigre from Chile, another Painouche, an elderly Spanish-speaking person, how people live, how they construct their families, how they take care of themselves, and how they make decisions together. So how do we see the strengths of culture, dynamics, families, and choices and narratives, and how you believe about what yourself and what those choices mean to status in your lives is very personal. But I think we're overly focused on national governments, and the one thing we didn't talk a lot about today is cities and regions and states and provinces as political things. People are very worried about the new US election results. Well, I live in Canada, where we had a prime minister for 10 years, pulled us out of Kyoto, the only country in the world, jacked up fossil fuels, would not allow climate change at any federal, provincial, or municipal table. And all of us mayors and provincial leaders got together, started decarbonizing our economy. Ontario, Quebec is 6% below, closed all our coal plants, put carbon pricing in over his dead body, introduced the first carbon tax, and the most rapidly decarbonizing economy, I think, in the Americas right now is most of Canada had a price on carbon of 80%. The United States hasn't done that yet, with all due respect, and I love our friends in Mexico, but they've got much more. The Mexicans are showing amazing leadership. So there's an opportunity right now because the UN is focused on treaties. The treaty's signed now. I can think you're going to see a green revolution in the United States led by Governor Inslee, Governor Brown, Governor Cuomo. I think you're going to see cities and mayors all across the US change the American politic in a way that you've never imagined. And that, and Prime Minister Harper gave us a foil. We all got to oppose his national agenda and that. So let's not confuse countries and national governments. Let's recognize that cities and provinces are real places and politics is attached to place. And the very last thing I want to say is let's not forget about forests and oceans. 54% of Canada's is a boreal forest. It absorbs 26 times all human emissions, all emissions on the planet. So 26 times all human emissions. So if it goes down, we all go down. And it will be 4 to 8 degrees Celsius over the next few decades. And we're not sure what that means for that forest. We know we're managing in the high danger zone for forests and for species like black and white spruce that may not survive that. And if we can't figure out a way to keep that ecosystem healthy and that carbon sink becomes a carbon source, nothing that goes on in our cities and reductions will compensate for that. And let's listen more to First Nations and Indigenous people. Our elders have understood this long before our scientists did. And if we've been listening to them 20, 25 years ago about our forests, we might have taken action because we'd have knowledge that we marginalized and ignored out of our own cultural arrogance. So I think there's some big things to say here, but let's not forget that we are first and foremost people and political units and activists, and mayors just will have to deal with that if their agendas are over, because it's not about mayors, it's about the people who live in cities.
Thank you very much. Max.
Well, I'd just like to say something about the urban heat island question, and also a little bit about the resilience point. So it's not exactly what the question asked, but one consideration about the heat island effect is that it really makes monitoring the global temperature increase difficult, because you always have to try to disentangle how much of that is coming from the fact that there's more urbanization around some of the observing stations. And there's a great effort, of course, that goes into doing that, but it does cause a constant problem. And then on the impacts of the increasing heat in urban areas, there's a major interest now in human health heat early warning systems. And WMO recently published a whole guideline on this, on how this is being done around the world. So I don't know as much about the infrastructure and solutions that you can do to bring down the heat, but certainly early warning systems is part of that solution. And on the resilience side, as was in the video I showed, a lot of cities, the biggest single climate and health problem in the world is air quality and respiratory disease. And so for a lot of the cities that are struggling, especially in these mega cities in the middle economy countries that are just, growing leaps and bounds, that are struggling with these air quality issues, a lot of the same tools that you use to deal with air quality, you also can use to manage your greenhouse gas emissions. So coming in from different entry points, you can still, none of these things, as was said, can be solved one thing at a time. So we need to look at what the issues are, where the climate linkages are, and then there's a package of things that can be brought in with that.
Thank you. Juichiro.
Yes. Regarding the question on the Senegal project, please let me introduce you to the website, which includes all the necessary information. So after this meeting, if we can have a bilateral, thank you very much. And just regarding the city, support for the city in climate change, we are still in the learning process. And as many of you know, we work with the national government and the focal points at the national government level. And also we work through the accredited entities. So we still need to know, and we still need to learn how we can work more closely and directly with the cities, and we need to consider this in the future. So we look forward to having more dialogues with the cities and the city networks that's out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Carolina?
Thank you very much. I think my last point that I want to make is it's obvious, but it should be made. The cost of inaction is enormous. And when I look around the world, I see the same thing that Mr. Mori pointed out. I see mayors realizing that before the national levels. Mayors meet the consequences of climate change, flooding, for example, in their daily work. And that is why we see a very strong willing to action on the local level. And that's where most things are done right now. But what we need to stress from the global level and from the national level is demanding that this work is done systematically, based on research, proper risk management, but also with an integrated approach. And the SDGs are excellent at creating this framework that is needed. And they, to my point, should be implemented both on the national level, but directly also on the local level, creating the framework that you need, getting your priorities right, and getting the action happening. And that's the key in the program that I was talking about before, that when creating funds, opening up funds from the government to the local level, we don't tell them exactly how to do it, but what we demand is a systematic approach. And that can be very different in different local conditions. But for example, that we demand that you think gender when you talk about flooding. There is a connection. And when you talk about transportation, that you have your social aspects with you, demanding that systematic approach I think is very, very important from the global level and from the national level. But also, that has been stressed, we have to listen and acknowledge the knowledge that are built up on the local level and using that. And I think the UN system can do better on that point, and having the ear to the ground, because that's where the answers are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to briefly respond to the one question directed at me on sustainable building technologies, indeed there are networks of groups that are working on that topic, and there are also green building councils that promote the use of innovative green technologies. And if we talk afterwards, I'd be happy to provide you with a couple of connections on that topic. We are out of time and over time. Apologies. Many thanks to the talented panel for a very interesting discussion, and Marcus for putting together the panel. And thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Thanks a lot.
Sorry for late.
No, thank you, sir.